Hi, everyone. Welcome to the How to Fish podcast. It's brought to you by Tailored Tackle. We are the premium beginner fishing brand. We make fishing tackle kits, rods and reels, fishing line, all the fishing tackle you would need packaged in a way that's super easy to get started fishing. And then we even make species specific and region specific tackle packages so that you can learn how to fish for a specific species or a specific region. Anyways, let's dive into today's podcast. It is going to be on fishing line. And what I'm going to do with this one, it's a beginner. I am going to walk you through the general fishing line types, how they are weighted out, and their lengths, what you're going to kind of need. And so I'm going to give you the basic overview of the most important fishing line material, sizes, lengths. And then I'm going to dive into how I like to think about fishing line, and how I have developed my favorite fishing lines for beginners, because the way that we've made them is the way that I want you to think about them. You don't have to buy them from us. I think they're a great deal. They're made for you, but the way that I think about them and the way that I've made them is how I think you should think about them. It's going to make your purchasing process and just the general upkeep and what you're putting on your reels a lot easier if you think about it the way that I do. And I think about it by species and region, just like we make our kits and we make our rods and reels. So let's dive into fishing line. The core piece of information that I think is going to be really critical here is the types of fishing line. There are three main types. Now, there are tons. And actually, let me preface this. Fishing line is super overwhelming. There are thousands and thousands of spools to choose from. You've got tons of brands out there, tons of different types of line that are branded and marketed in different ways. There's a million different sizes from 2-pound test all the way up to 150-pound test. There's so much out there that it gets super confusing. I even know when I was beginning as a kid, it was confusing. And it's taken me a couple years now to figure it all out and really thoroughly understand fishing line. So basically it breaks down into three, and let's get started with those. You've got three types. You have monofilament, you have braid, and you have fluorocarbon. Now, some of them are a little bit more expensive. They kind of go like that. So monofilament's the cheapest, braid's the second, and then fluorocarbon's the most expensive. Now, don't let price dictate what fishing line material you buy. Each one of these serves a very specific purpose. So let's go over the pros and cons of each and why you would buy a certain one. So monofilament is just the basics. If you have ever fished before, or when you were a kid, or if you just got, one of those rods and reels that already had the line on it or whatever, you were probably using monofilament. Also, slang is mono. And mono is the least expensive, but it actually serves like a bunch of different purposes, and it's a very well-rounded line. So if you are trying to catch a bunch of different fish, you want to work a bunch of different types of lures, you don't want to break the bank, you can just buy a monofilament line and just call it a day. And so what mono does, these are the pros of mono. Mono is clear. It can be painted different colors, but you generally would want to stick around the clear. So it's lower visibility. It stretches, it floats, it doesn't float, but it floats. Like it's more buoyant. It will sink, but it sinks a lot slower. And it's cheap. Now, these are pros and cons kind of in a way. So mono floats, it doesn't sink. This is important for a couple different things, right? So like if you were to throw out a topwater lure, or if you were fishing for trout and you wanted your dough bait to rise up in the water column, there's a bunch of different reasons why you would want your line to float or be more buoyant than the others. And we'll kind of get into that when I go into the species section. But monofilament is just a really great, well-rounded thing. And so, it's not as expensive. Its diameter, which is the line thickness, is probably the largest. But I think the casting distance is great. I think the weight is right around where it needs to be. Like monofilament is just the basic, and I use it all the time. I use it especially when I'm trying to go for a bunch of different things. Like I put it on the reel that is kind of my well-rounded reel. It goes on our multi-species combo. But when I want to catch all sorts of different things, and I don't want to break the bank, this is what I put on because it floats. Well, not float, but it's buoyant. And it stretches, which is actually a good thing for a beginner because it's a bit more forgiving. Now, a lot of people, you'll see a lot of marketers say like, no stretch. You want it really taut. And that's true for really sensitive bites, and for very technical presentations as well as drag management. But at the end of the day, when you're a beginner, you don't have solid drag management. You aren't looking for the most perfect bite indication. What you're really looking for is something that's a little bit more forgiving. And because it stretches, when you kind of make mistakes on landing the fish or not setting your hook hard enough the first time and then have to set it again, or, there's stretch actually forgives a lot of mistakes. You'll lose less fish as a beginner with mono than you would if you were to use one of these, if you were to use braid or fluorocarbon that doesn't have stretch. So I do really like mono when you're first getting started. It has a lot of different purposes, right? I really like that it floats. I think it casts fine. I think it's durable. It's all around just like one of your reels should have it on it if you're owning multiple reels. But if you're a beginner and you just got started, throw on monofilament and just get started that way because you're going to save some money. And you do kind of want it to be buoyant if you want to go for trout or throw any topwater lures out there. You also want to have it stretch so it's forgiving when you make mistakes. Which you will make mistakes. Some of the cons that I do want to talk about are memory issues. So memory is when the line forms to a specific shape. So when you first get line off of a spool, if it's monofilament, it has memory, meaning that it remembers how it was spooled onto the spool itself. So it kind of holds to that pattern and you have to stretch it out to get it to kind of relax a little bit. And then if you keep it on your reel for a long time and don't use it, it starts remembering that reel. And so that kind of circular cylindrical shape, the line will remember that. And then when you go to cast, it'll kind of spool out. So you'll see that a lot when you send the line, when you buy a rod and reel that has the line on it. It'll hold to that memory and then it'll all kind of spool out in a cylindrical shape, and you want it to be straight when you cast it out. That's why we don't send our reels out with line. I know some customers get a little upset because they buy our rods and reels and they see that there's no line on it, but it's really bad for the line to ship it that way and store it that way for long periods of time because, we're building thousands of them. We can't just store them with the line on them because it damages the line, and then it also forms that memory in that really tight shape. And that's why when you buy one of those cheaper reels with a line on it, it is kind of like it's like curly hair when you try to cast it out. So if you have monofilament and you want to remove the memory, a great way to do that when you're spooling on your reel is to put the spool of the line that came on the spool that is holding the reel right now, not your spool on your reel. That was confusing. Okay. The line that is on the spool that you purchased, not on your reel. So you put that spool of line that you bought in the water, and then you reel it onto your reel while it's submerged in water, or you submerge the cap of your reel in water after you put it on. Basically, the concept is that water, the mono will absorb it a little bit and it'll stretch out and it'll remove that memory. And another thing is just if you were on a boat or on the shore and you cast it out and then you walked a long ways with your bail open, and then you reeled it back in, that'll kind of stretch the line out. It'll put water into the line and that'll reduce the memory. So whenever I'm spooling monofilament, you'll see in the ebooks, like I put it in a bowl of water while I'm putting it onto my reel, or I'll soak it in water. But you want it wet when you're putting it on. So that is monofilament. Let's work over to the next one, which is braid. Braid is awesome. I love braid. Braid is a strand woven line, so it's a braided material. It's not synthetic like monofilament. It's not a polymer. It's braid. It's like physical string, and it's woven really tightly. And it's awesome because it's super strong for the size of its diameter. So that means that, like, if you were to buy braid at a higher pound test, and I'll get into the test and weights and stuff like that in a bit, but if you were to buy one that could really handle a big fish, it won't be thick. It won't be really, really thick. It'll be like the same size as a much lighter line of any other material. So that's really the main advantage, is that it's a smaller diameter for how strong it can be, which is great. And so the other thing too is that I would say it's right in the middle between monofilament and fluorocarbon, the one we're going to talk about next, in terms of buoyancy. And so it should sink. It won't sink very fast. It won't sink as fast as fluorocarbon, but it won't float as long as monofilament. So it sinks. It has zero stretch. And that's something that a lot of more expert anglers really like. Zero stretch is great because it has a really fine bite indication, and your hook sets have no give. So it's a tough hook set. But see, the issue with no stretch is that if you get hung up on something, or you're using too light a pound to test, or whatever it is, it's not very forgiving. So if you make a mistake in your hook set, or you make a mistake landing the fish, it'll probably snap because the tension's really high. When you have stretch in mono, you'll see this too when you get the fish up and it's flapping around and stuff like that. That stretch will give a little bit, whereas if you have zero stretch, that fish is going to snap the line if it yanks hard enough. If the pressure on the line is hard enough, the line will snap. So that's something to keep in mind with braid. And then the other thing is that what's really great about braid is that it has no memory issues, and it's very abrasion resistant. So it's great. Some of the cons, besides a lot of these things are not cons, they're just give and take of why you would use it, right? So like stretch versus no stretch, there's a reason why you would want stretch at times. There's a reason why you wouldn't want stretch at times. There's a reason why you would want something to float or why you wouldn't want something to float. And so, but the last thing that's really awesome about braid is that it has zero memory because it's not a polymer. It's not synthetic, and so it doesn't remember the cylindrical form of your reel or the spool that it's on. So when you put it on and you cast it back out and you reel it back in, you cast it back out, it doesn't have any memory. It doesn't coil up, which is great. Now, there's plenty of more pros than cons versus monofilament, but you pay for that. So braid is more expensive, and it's generally going to be pretty expensive. So we make a very affordable version, but once you get up into some higher tiers of braid, so there's a couple different tiers. There's 4-strand, then there's 8-strand. There's also 16-strand and some crazy things out there too. We just make 4-strand. I don't think you need more than that. I don't think it's that important. But yeah, you can definitely splurge and get a really, really high-end braid. The reason why I like getting quality line, I don't like getting insane premium line, because none of this is going to be durable for forever. If you're fishing a lot, like, it will fade. There will be abrasion. There will be lost lures and lost line because you got hung up on something. Like, you should be respooling once a season as a beginner, and then if you're fishing a lot, you should be respooling at least twice a season. And so with that in mind, if you're constantly needing to update, what I've seen happen, even with myself, is buying really high premium line and then running it down to the nub of like only 100 yards left on my spool because I didn't want to get rid of my premium line. But now I'm at a huge disadvantage if I get a big fish on, or if I get hung up for the day and I have to lose half my line and restart again. I don't have enough line on my reel to fish effectively. And so just keep that in mind. You always want to spool up an appropriate amount when you start to get low. Anything less than like 100 yards in most cases, like you need to add, but you need to replace your line. So keep that in mind. The last one material that we're going to talk about is fluorocarbon. And this kind of breaks off into two. There's pure fluorocarbon and then there's fluorocarbon coated. But fluorocarbon in general is it's awesome, but it's technical. So like I would not recommend fluorocarbon to a novice. There's a couple reasons, but let's get started with the pros. Fluorocarbon's awesome because it's virtually invisible. So like it's very, very, very low visibility. It's lower visibility than mono. It's really amazing what it can do in terms of low visibility. The other thing is that there's no stretch and there's no memory, which is awesome. And so it's super tight. I mean, no stretch again, like it depends, but once you get good, you kind of don't want any stretch most of the time. It sinks, it doesn't float. So just remember with these three that we've talked about, monofilament will float, braid will sink slowly, and then fluorocarbon will sink fast. So just keep that in mind. And then fluorocarbon's really expensive. And so why would there be two types, pure fluorocarbon versus fluorocarbon coated? Now, pure fluorocarbon, 100% fluorocarbon, I use as leader material. I don't think anyone should be using 100% fluorocarbon spooled on their reel. And that's because it has such a resistance to memory and such a resistance to stretch that it spools out straight too much. So it's not very flexible. So a lot of the times, like I've tried this too, especially ice fishing, because you don't need that much line to ice fish. So it's not super expensive to spool 100 yards onto a reel. I mean, it's not cheap, but it's not egregious. The issue with it is it's too stiff so that it'll fly out. It wants to get out of how you coiled it up on your reel. So it almost has like the reverse problem where it'll just like it's so memory resistant that it wants to stay straight too much. And it's not flexible. So then all of a sudden you'll open up your bail and it'll spool out like crazy. But the thing is that 100% fluorocarbon is virtually invisible. And so that's why it's a really great leader material. A leader is something that you would put on the end of your line, especially with braid, because braid is going to be very visible because it's not clear. So whatever braid you use, it could be low visibility like a gray or a blue, but it's still going to be visible. Whereas if you added a foot or two of fluorocarbon on the end of it, the area where your bait line is virtually invisible. So that's very helpful. And so I use 100% fluorocarbon on my leaders, but I don't spool up my whole reel with 100% fluorocarbon. I know that there are guys out there that are doing this and are really championing it. I don't understand it. So if there's any listeners out there that want to email me and explain it to me, I'd love to hear it. I've watched a few things and I've tried it a lot myself, but I think that it ends up with a lot of tangles. I also don't think pure fluorocarbon is good for really, really cold weather, because it stiffens up even more when it's really cold. So the lesson here is don't go ice fishing with pure fluorocarbon, because I made that mistake. my video guy Cam was filming with us too, and he was using the pure fluorocarbon one, and he almost took a swing at me. He was so upset because we kept losing fish on that one, or like dealing with tangles and all sorts of nonsense. So, but how do we take the benefits of sinking fluorocarbon and virtually invisibleness? Is I like fluorocarbon coated monofilament. And so it's a really good hybrid where the core is mono, so it's not stiff, it's flexible, and it has a little bit of stretch. It's not just like rigid, but it's coated in fluorocarbon to reduce the visibility and to also add those sinking powers. So fluorocarbon coated is like right around, I would say, the cost of braid, maybe a bit less. We definitely sell it less, but most of the time, if you try to find a fluorocarbon coated line, it's going to be right in the middle between mono and braid, and maybe around braid's cost. But yeah, I really like fluorocarbon coated because it takes like a mixture of both of those things. And so, yeah, those are the three lines that we're talking about. Now let's talk about pound test, which is the fishing line's strength. And that is its breaking strength. So the amount of weight that can be put on it in pressure before the fishing line would break. Now, this is kind of a fluid concept because it's a pressure measurement, meaning that, like, you know, you could reel in a 10-pound fish on 4-pound line as long as the tension doesn't, go past 4 pounds. And so if you were to take, like, let's say an 8-pound fish on 8-pound monofilament line and lift it up, it should break. If you were to lift it up out of the water, now if you drag it through the water, there's just so many factors that go into the pressure of the line. And so I just don't want you to think it's one for one, meaning that, like, an 8-pound fish is going to break 8-pound line every single day of the week. It's not. It's if you were to put it into a vacuum, so like scientific testing, and you were to put an 8-pound weight at the end of 8-pound line, that's the maximum, and then anything over that it would break. If it was just holding it up straight with all other variables controlled. So just know that we're talking about generalities. So pound test goes from 2 pounds to 150 pounds, but really 80% of the line is going to be 20 pounds or less. That's generally what you're looking at in terms of pound strength. And so most of the fishing line that you're going to see at a store is going to be at the lowest end 4 pounds, and at the highest end probably 30, 45 pounds. The majority of your choices are going to be 6-pound, 8-pound, 10-pound, 12-pound, 15-pound, 20-pound, 25, 30. Like, that's what you're kind of looking at. And they should have them in the various materials. Now, mono, you typically won't find larger than 30 pounds because the diameter is so high. And then on the higher end, you're going to see a lot of braids that are up higher, even in that 45 to 50 pound range, because the diameter can be a lot smaller for their breaking strength. Remember, that was a positive when you come when we go to braid, is that for a lower diameter, it still has a higher breaking strength. So what are you going to pick? You should be in that range of 6 to 20. Like, that should be your general range. If you are just a general freshwater angler, you're going for bass, walleye, trout, perch, panfish, pike. Like, that should just be your general range. And then what you would want to focus on from there would get more narrowed down between that 6-pound to 20-pound test. And so back to this pressure conversation that we were having a little bit in the beginning, it's not a one-way street. It's not like the 6-pound bass is going to put on exactly 6 pounds of tension. It is fighting in a different way, and you are pulling in a different way. And so that pressure can vary, and it can go from 2 pounds of pressure to 10 pounds of pressure to 3 pounds of pressure. And so what you would want to do is get kind of like a general concept where, you know, if the trophy fish that you're after is kind of around, you know, 5 to 6 pounds, then 8 pounds is probably going to be your go-to because the pressure fluctuates. And then if it were to get hung up in weeds and now you're adding those weeds to it and it's and you're pulling it at the same time, or if you're not fishing with a net where you'd have to lift it up out of the water, it's just not a one-for-one relationship. So I would say that a good way of thinking about it is going a couple pounds heavier than the trophy sized fish of the fish you're going after. And so, you know, and the only thing that gets weird about that is braid, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And so that's pound test. If you just wanted like, hey, what do I go with? What is like a well-rounded one? Just 8 pounds is going to do pretty much everything you need to in freshwater when it's monofilament. And you know, or 8-pound fluorocarbon coated. Braid's different, but that's just kind of like the general 8 pounds is fine. So, but then you could ask me, hey, Ed, why would I want to go lighter? Why would I go and buy a 6 or 8 pound test when there's 30 or 40 pound test, right? Like, why wouldn't I just want to get the heaviest test out there so then I would never have a chance of breaking off a fish ever? And the problem with that is that in order to get heavier pound test, a heavier breaking strength, the line needs to be thicker. So in general, as you go up in pound test, you also go up in line diameter. And so the heavier you go, typically, the thicker the line is going to get. And that becomes a problem because when you're dealing with really thick line, you can't spool up enough for casting. And then it's also really hard to cast really thick line. So like the thicker the line, the less casting distance you're going to get. And the heavier the lure it would take to pull that line out. And so it becomes a challenge. So, you know, it's not as effective, let's say, to go and put on a 20-pound monofilament line onto your reel. If you just have a regular freshwater reel, you're only going to be able to hold like maybe 50, 75 yards of that. And you're only going to be able to cast like 20 feet in front of you. Whereas if you were to have 6-pound or 8-pound monofilament, you'd be able to, I mean, 20 is actually pretty good. I would say about 10 feet in front of you. With a 8 or 6 pound test, you'll be able to kind of hit that 30, 40 yard mark consistently, depending on the lure weight. But yeah, and so it's give and take, right? And so you don't want it so heavy that you can't cast your lure anywhere. And if you did get a fish on and it was pulling, you wouldn't run out of line. And so, yeah, so just keep that in mind that like the reason why you would go like lower, like 6 to 10 pounds maybe is like the range. When you're thinking, oh, well, I could just buy 15 or 20 pound, the diameter will be too thick. When we are talking about monofilament and fluorocarbon, braid's going to be a little bit different, as I keep saying. So, you know, that's pound strength. I think that's really kind of how you should be thinking about it. You should first think, okay, what is the material? Because the material has a lot to do with the style of fishing that I'm doing. Then what is the pound test? And then, because I don't want you guys to worry about diameter because it's just another factor in here. Just know that like diameter generally goes with the pound test. So if you get a heavier pound test, it's going to be thicker in diameter. And so the last one that I want you to, well, the third one I want you to think about is how many yards you're buying. That's actually really important because I think a lot of people will go and they'll see, oh, okay, this one, it's 120 yards of blah, 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 and it's cheaper than this other one, so I'm just going to go with this one. That 120 yards is fine. It probably isn't for your reel. So like a general multi-species reel like ours, like an average sized freshwater fishing reel, should be able to hold around 150 to 200 yards of 8-pound monofilament. Ours holds 185. And so you want to get at least like 200 yards when you're buying a spool. A little bit less is fine. If you bought like 150, you're going to be fine, because that's the other thing, is that I don't want you to fill the spool to its absolute capacity that it's labeled as, because that capacity is the capacity, but you're going to have a hard time if you have the line to the very thickest margin of your reel, because it'll spool out because it's not really getting pressed in vertically. So I actually like to leave like maybe 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch of space between the lip of the spool and how much line I'm putting on, because you're going to have less tangles that way. You don't want to over spool your reel. If you over spool your reel, it's going to spool out on you. It's going to pile out on you because there's not a lot holding it down. The top lip of the spool isn't holding it down if you reach the maximum of the capacity. And so just keep that in mind. I always like to have about 1/8 of an inch separation between the line and the lip on the top of the spool. So just a little hint there. So if that's the case, like, don't buy 120 yards, but also you don't have to buy 1,000 yards, right? What we do is we make all of our line in 400 yards, because then you have 2 spools worth of fishing line. Because I always hated, a lot of the lines are sold in like 320 and like 180 and stuff. And it like either isn't enough for one spool or enough for a spool and a half, and that just drove me nuts. So we just decided to make them in 400 yards so that you have enough for 2 spools. So you can either spool up 2 reels, or it's enough for 1 season of an advanced angler, or 2 years worth for a beginner angler. And so I don't know why more people don't just do that. It was driving me nuts, so that's what we did. The only one that we have that's like over 400 is our surf fishing braided line, because you should have about 500 yards for surf fishing. And then the only thing that's lower is our fluorocarbon leader line, because it's just 30 yards of pure fluorocarbon, because you should only be using like a 1.5 to 3 feet of fluorocarbon leader at a time. Anyways, so that's your length. So don't buy less than 150, but you don't really need to buy more than 300 if you're spooling up not 300. You don't need to buy more than like 250 if you're spooling up one reel, because you're just going to have half of a reel line left over, and there's nothing you can do with that. Drives me nuts. So either buy 400 or buy 200, which is what I recommend. Anyways, then there's color, which is like the fourth thing, and I wouldn't put too much emphasis on color outside of how it functions. So like for fluorocarbon and monofilament, I believe that you should just buy clear line. It should just be clear. I think that's the go-to. I think the purpose of buying that line was for low visibility, and you should have it be clear. For braided line in freshwater, I believe that low visibility colors are going to put your best foot forward, but they're still going to be visible. So like a low visibility gray or a low visibility blue, which means like a darker gray or a darker blue, those both work well. But at the end of the day, you should be putting on a 1.5 2 foot long fluorocarbon leader anyways. So it's not a huge deal. The only time that I really care about color is going back to surf fishing. I like high visibility yellow braid, just because of the nature of surf fishing. You have to keep track of where your line is relative to the currents and the wind and the surf. And so if you're in a position where you are fishing really choppy water and you have to keep an eye out on where your line is going and why it's going a certain way, then maybe high visibility yellow. But I don't think that that's really going to pertain to you if you're fishing in freshwater. So to recap on that, like any of the synthetic line that's going to be fluorocarbon coated, or monofilament, just go with a clear. And then for braided line, go with low visibility colors. And they'll typically be advertised as low vis gray or low vis blue or low vis dark blue or whatever it is. Just like that dark blue, dark green, dark gray, those do well. And then your 100% fluorocarbon should just be 100% fluorocarbon. It shouldn't have any color to it. And so that'll just be like ultra clear. And so that's color. So I know I spit a lot of information at you guys about the material, what each one does, the pound strength, the color, a little bit about the diameter, and the length of the line. Then you've got like a ton of different brands that make all of this. They call it a bunch of different stuff, even though it's all just kind of these three things. It's fluorocarbon, monofilament, or braid. But there's a million things out there. So what I did is I made basically a total catalog of 6 fishing lines. And I'm very unlikely to make any more. This is what I use for everything. And I break it down by species and kind of like 2 regions, which I think make it really straightforward. And it kind of summarizes everything. So like, what would I use for bass, or what would I use for trout, or what would I use for walleye, or what would I use if I just wanted to fish for a bunch of random stuff in freshwater. And so instead of creating, 2 pounds to 20 pounds of monofilament, and there's 7 different spools and you have to pick from all of them, I'm just giving you exactly the pound test, material, and length and color of line that I use for something. And there's only 6 of them. And I think that if you buy from us, this is easy and I would appreciate it. But if you are, in love with another brand, or you've got something specific in mind, just follow the way that I've structured this line, because I think this is going to be your best combination for what you're trying to do. So to start off, the well-rounded line for the basic angler that just wants to go for a bunch of different stuff in freshwater is 8-pound monofilament in clear. This is just great if you're fishing with family and friends, you're fishing off the dock, you're going to go 5 or 6 times a year, you're going to go for pike and bass and bluegill and whatever. I think that 8-pound mono is a great all-around line. The stretch is forgiving for a beginner. You don't have to break the bank. I think our freshwater fishing line's $12.99 for 400 yards. So you could spool up 2 reels for like $6 each, and it's still high-end line. It's still premium line. So that's kind of like, just if you just wanted to get out there and catch some fish, you're not super focused on something specific, that's what I would go with. So just remember that. If it's ours or somebody else's, 8-pound monofilament, try to get it in that 400 yards so you can fill up 2 spools, or 200 yards. The next one that I think in popularity would be, let's just stick with monofilament. Trout. For trout, it's basically the same thing. If you wanted to start going into more specific things, here's the other 5 that are more specific when you're wanting to kind of zero in on something. So our trout fishing line is the same composite of the freshwater, but it's in 6-pound test. you're typically not going to get an opportunity for a trout that's larger than 4 to 5 pounds. And the slimmer that you can go, the better for trout, because the lures are typically much smaller and lighter. And so if you have lighter, thinner diameter line, you can cast those lures out farther. Also, the lower pound test you can get, the less of a diameter, the less visibility. These are all great. I know a lot of people use fluorocarbon coated stuff for trout, but the problem with that is that it sinks. So you want it to float, because a lot of trout lures are surface lures, or a lot of the baits are floating baits. So like the most common bait to use for trout is a floating power bait, floating dough bait. Well, if you use braid or you use fluorocarbon, it'll fight against that and it won't let the bait float up. So you always want to use mono when you're fishing baits for trout. And then, yes, you can use fluorocarbon coated line or braided line for casting lures, but I like to just keep my trout poles, just able to do bait and lures. So I put 6 pound on all of my trout reels in mono. For bass, this is kind of the time where you go into braid. And so remember when I was talking about like, you don't want to go up to 20 pound mono when you're casting because you're not going to be able to cast very far. This is going to flip that a little bit. I go with a low vis gray braid in 20 pound test for bass fishing. And I've actually had a couple people write to me and be like, oh, why do you recommend 20 pound for braided line? Like, I've never used more than 8 pound monofilament. And that's because the diameter of the braid is really slim in comparison. So for example, like 8 pound monofilament is 25 millimeters, or sorry, 0.25 millimeters thick in diameter, whereas 20 pound braid is only 0.18 millimeters in diameter. And so it's almost like thinner. It is thinner. It's thinner than 8 pound monofilament. So you can really step up your poundage on braid and not lose a lot of your casting distance, which is super important. And so why not go up to 20 pounds in braid? If you can cast it as far as, maybe 6 pound, 8 pound monofilament, why not go with 20 pound braid, which is what we recommend. I don't like to go higher than that, because you do start see the braid is heavier it's than monofilament, and so you do get a diminishing return as you go up higher and higher and higher. And so if you were to use, I would guess like probably 35 pounds, maybe 35 should be the same diameter as an 8 pound mono. It will be tougher to cast that than the 8 pound mono because it'll be heavier. And so just keep that in mind. So anyways, how I think about it is 20 pound low vis gray braid for bass. I think 4 strand is fine. I don't think you need to splurge on 8 strand or 16 strand. I personally haven't seen a difference. I think it's kind of a gimmick, because braid is really tough. And so if it's 20 pound braid, it's 20 pound braid. Like, I don't think you need to make it more abrasion resistant. But you can, and it can be stronger. So if you really want to splurge, you can go up to 8 strand or some of the more gimmicky ones. I'm not saying that they're not premium. I'm just saying I don't see their use. But yeah. And so with that braid, you're always going to have visibility issues. Now with bass are pretty aggressive. So like, I've caught a ton of bass just casting braid without a leader. But it doesn't hurt to throw on a fluorocarbon leader when the bass are finicky. Now, the more knots and swivels and stuff you put on your line, the more room for error there is in knot tying and whatever. And so I do see a lot of people add a bunch of different hardware onto their line and then lose fish because of user error, not because of the line strength. So just keep that in mind. Like, if you're a beginner and you're just like getting started and you want to go for bass, like, you're going to catch bass on pure braided line tied to your lure. It's going to be fine. If you wanted to optimize it perfectly, I would add 1 to 2 feet of fluorocarbon leader to the end of your line. And you can do that as a beginner with a swivel, where you just tie a barrel swivel onto both ends. We have barrel swivels in like all of our kits. But if you don't want to buy one of our kits, you can look up barrel swivels and buy them in bulk, or buy them at your tackle shop. If you are an expert or want to get really precise, there's a couple different knots, like a blood knot or a surgeon knot, that you can tie where the fluorocarbon can get tied directly onto your braid, which is pretty cool. And it's helpful too, because if you accidentally like reel in too much, it doesn't, you don't have a swivel to get caught on the eyelet on the top of your rod guide. Anyways, that's a little too complicated, but that's kind of a very common pairing, is braided line on with a fluorocarbon leader. We make our fluorocarbon leader in 25 pound because the diameter is fine, and I like just that like extra insurance of 5 pounds, even though it's heavier than the 20, because I also just like, I don't like to have a bunch of different spools on me, and so I use fluorocarbon 25 pound as my leader line on my surf fishing and saltwater stuff, and I use it on my bass fishing stuff. And so I just didn't make different sizes. I think 25 pound fluorocarbon leader just works for everything almost that you're ever going to go after. And so that's just what I use, and that's what I made. And so then like the last one, if you're a surf fisherman or a saltwater fisherman, I make 30 pound high vis yellow braid. I think 30 pound is kind of that perfect combination of being able to surf cast lures, but still heavy enough, if you manage your drag correctly, to land really big bruiser, 40, 50 pound fish. You can. And I have, you can see pictures on all of our stuff of the giant drum and shark we've caught on pretty light braided line. I like 30 pounds because a lot of times you got to really cast far. And when you get up into that 50 to 60 pound braid, not only is it tough to cast, but you're really concerned about how much line you're letting out, because bigger fish will spool your line. You'll run out. And so I always like to have at least 500 yards. Most surf fishing reels can't hold more than 500 yards of 30 pound. And so I'd much rather be lighter and have 400 yards to work with on a running fish with my drag than I would 300 yards of 50 pound braid that it doesn't matter if he's running or if it's 50 or 30, he's just going to run it all the way out because he's a 60 pound shark or something like that, which I've run into many, many times in my life. So this probably doesn't pertain to most of the listeners. I will do a whole surf fishing thing at some point, but 30 pound braid is great for saltwater. I love it. Even when I'm inshore fishing, I think the perfect ideal inshore fishing line would be 25 pound high vis yellow. And so I float back and forth between 20 pound and 30 pound because that's what I make for inshore saltwater fishing, which means like if you're fishing off a boat or in a kayak or something like that. But I think 30 pound is great. So that's how I think about it. So let me just recap real quick. So these are the lines that we offer, this is how I want you to think about it, so that you can either buy these ones or go and buy somebody else's. Just think about them in this framework. So 8 pound monofilament for general freshwater fishing, 6 pound monofilament for trout fishing, 20 pound braid for bass fishing, 8 pound fluorocarbon coated for walleye fishing, 30 pound braid for surf fishing, and then up to your preference, anywhere between 20 to 30 pounds in braid for inshore fishing. If you are fishing with braided line, it would be wise to get good at tying knots and add a foot to 2 feet of fluorocarbon leader. That's pure 100% fluorocarbon leader. I use 25 pound 100% fluorocarbon leader for almost all of my leader making, freshwater and saltwater. And so that's kind of the recap. It shouldn't be so challenging to pick out this line. I think that retailers and manufacturers love to have a bunch of different options to really granularly pick out what you want to pick out, and specialize and stuff like that, which I do think that there's a use case for that with the experts. Like, I definitely have friends that, are extremely competitive in fishing, and some guys that have tons of years of experience on them, and they like to have 12 different rods and reels with a bunch of different line sizes. And that's why all of these lines have been created for that person. Whereas if you're listening to this, I don't think you're that person. And so it becomes really challenging to pick which one is right to put on your 1 to 2 reels, because there's thousands of them to pick from. So the lines that I've talked about towards the end of this episode, these are the only lines I use. And I don't think you have to get crazier than what I'm recommending. Anyways, that is the recap. If you go to our website, tailoredtackle.com, you can see all of these fishing line options that are available. We make them pretty affordable. I think that our fluorocarbon our monos are like $12.99. Our bass braid is, I think, $17.99, and then our surf braid is like $19.99. And our fluorocarbon leader is like, I don't know, it's cheap. It's like $10 or maybe $12. Anyways, don't quote me on that, because prices change, and with tariffs and all sorts of stuff happening with taxes and things these days, prices in all of the fishing world should be fluctuating a bit. But we'll always do what we can to make sure that you guys get a really good deal. One thing I wanted to say, because if you're a crappie, panfish, perch angler, yes, if you wanted to specialize in those smaller species, you should go down to a specialized 4-pound test. I might make that someday. I just know that a lot of you guys out there that are our listeners and our customers aren't super focused on specialized panfish gear. If you are, let me know. But the moral here is that in the summertime, when you are fishing, really spring, fall, and summer, panfish are going to be so aggressive that like they're going to hit on 6-pound test. It's not going to matter that you have the difference between 4-pound and 6-pound. I have never seen a difference in the heat of summer when the bluegill are going nuts, or in the spring when the crappies are post spawn. I think 6-pound, if I were to recommend one of our lines for somebody that wants to focus on bluegill, crappie, and perch, I would say use our 6-pound monofilament for trout. But again, if you were to use 8-pound mono on your line, because you're going to try to catch a couple northern pikes and some bass and hopefully a walleye and whatever, rabid bluegill are not going to avoid your line because it's a 0.25 millimeter diameter versus a 0.2. It's just not going to happen. They're going to hit it. So unless you really want to specialize for those smaller fish, I wouldn't worry about it. If you do, go find a good 4-pound test out there. Hopefully I'll make one day. So that wraps everything up. Thank you so much for listening. If you guys could leave us a review, it'd be super helpful. I love any feedback, positive and negative. I'm doing my best over here. We're definitely going to get some guests on, not to do the kind of tell me about your background and stuff, but more so that I can get experts on here to answer really good fishing questions and give you their top tips and advice. So basically, I'm just going to grill them, and I'm going to be like, hey, I'm a beginner. Tell me what to do for X, Y, and Z, so that I can get that information to you guys immediately. And there's not a lot of fluff. If you haven't noticed, I don't have a lot of fluff in my podcast, because it frustrates me when I have to waste a half an hour listening to somebody talk about what's in the news versus like what I want to hear about, which is fishing related, right? So I'm doing my best with that, and we'll get some guests on and I'll cover some more topics. Thank you so much for listening. Have a great day.